Hello and welcome to this Micro Focus ArcSight connector video. This particular connector that we're looking at today is the Smart Connector for Amazon Web Services CloudTrail. And CloudTrail is one of three different connectors we have for Amazon. We have CloudTrail for largely VPC logs and infrastructure type events around actions that are occurring on your actual AWS infrastructure. So things like spin up of a VM or deletion of a subnet interface, etc., etc. So more operational type stuff. CloudWatch and particularly Security Hub tend to be far more focused on very, very relevant security information and events. So this is more of an operational type log collection, but still holds a lot of interesting events that can be utilized nonetheless. So I wanted to start today by talking a little bit about how our CloudTrail connector works. So firstly, I've opened up here the Amazon Web Services config guide from our smart connectors. This is version 7.15. Version 8 has literally just been released, but this is all still pretty much the same. So we'll keep going with it. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of the services and the architecture and the end-to-end flow of events that occur in AWS delivering logs and then our connector actually picking them up and processing them into Ceph. So we have a couple of important pieces in AWS. Firstly, we have S3. Now S3 is simple storage. Think of it as just a bucket, and that's what they call it in Amazon, just a straight bucket. It's where files live and so forth. And that's where CloudTrail delivers those log files in gzipped JSON format. And when it does so, it obviously has a file rotation mechanism. And after each log file is gzipped and written to S3, what it does is it actually sends off what's called an SNS notification. And an SNS notification stands for Simple Notification Service. And what can happen is that we have another service called SQS, a Simple Queuing Service. And what happens here is that the SQS service effectively subscribes to the SNS topic. So it's a bit like a Kafka topic, if you will. So when a new message arrives, I'm interested in it, I'm subscribed to it, I want to know when that notification comes in. When I receive a notification, a message is delivered to SQS, and our Smart Connector actually sits here as an SQS client, and it is polling what's called a queue. And when a new message arrives on the queue, it can basically go off, read the message, and inside the message from SQS will actually be the file path to the new gzipped JSON zip file that has all the new events for processing. So it then takes that file path as an S3 client, pulls down a copy of that gzip file, and then processes it from JSON into Ceph and then onto your various ArcSight or even non-ArcSight destinations. So that's the basic end-to-end flow. So I really wanted to highlight the fact that there's some key services in here: service S3, SQS, and SNS. So there's a couple of pieces there. In terms of setting up the AWS infrastructure, it's reasonably straightforward. There's only a couple of steps involved. Most of the configuration actually involves creating a CloudTrail itself. So we'll actually go into CloudTrail in a very shortly and set this all up. And in doing so, we create a trail. We also create an S3 bucket, and we also create that SNS topic for which, when a new file is dumped into S3, we'll send a notification off to the SNS topic. And that, of course, can lead to eventually the connector picking up a copy of the new ready-to-process events. We also need to obviously set up an AWS account and have appropriate access permissions for those things to occur. Obviously, to read the files from S3, so we need some read access there on S3, and we need some access to the SQS service as well, so we can actually pick up those messages and obviously also delete them, because once we've received a message with the location of the next log file, we definitely do not want to receive another message of the same that's exactly the same, because that would mean obviously event duplication, and that would be a bad thing. So we'll set up a user and a group with these two permissions here. That's rather straightforward, and we'll demonstrate that very shortly. In terms of configuring the CloudTrail, it's literally just a case of creating the buckets, creating the notification, setting it to a particular region, and then switching on SNS, the notification delivery for every log file that's sent and it's available to us. We'll also create the SQS queue, and the SQS queue will be subscribed to the SNS topic, and then also the SQS URL, this piece here, is the URL that we will actually pass to the Smart Connector, and it will poll that URL via its programmatic API access with a key pair, and grab new informational messages around what the next log file will be. So it's reasonably straightforward, and then after that it's literally just a case of installing the connector itself. So let's get started by configuring AWS up, ready for CloudTrail. So firstly, let's set up the user and group with the appropriate access permissions that we're looking for to instantiate CloudTrail. So I've got a user group here. We'll just call it ArcSight group. You'll see that it's got absolutely no permissions whatsoever at the moment. But what we're going to do here is attach policies from Amazon to it. So if I go to attach policies and I start typing in the name of the policy that I'm interested in, you'll see them pop up here. Now we've got read-only access for S3 and full access. As you'd expect, we really want the minimum to be applied here. So we'll click on this. So that's now applied. And we also want SQS, but we need full access for SQS because we need to be able to delete event messages and so forth. So I'll click on that one as well. Hit OK. I've now got my ArcSight user group with appropriate permissions applied. So I'm all done there. All I want to do now is actually create a new user that will inherit these permissions. And I'll just call it ArcSight CloudTrail user. I only really need programmatic access. I can add them to a group, which I'll do here now. I can copy permissions from an existing user, and I can just attach those same policies that I just applied to the group at the individual user level as well. So that's quite okay. Either way works just fine. Create the user. Now this is where our access and secret key are given to us. Now we're best off to download a copy of that, otherwise we will never be able to see the secret access key. And we're done. So if you go back into the CloudTrail user, you'll notice that you can actually see the access key, but you can never gain access to the secret key ever again. So make sure you take a copy of that CSV file. You can delete and create new ones if you wish. So that's all done. The user's ready to go. Now what we'll do is we'll go into CloudTrail itself, and this is just another service, so you can gain access to it from the management console by typing in CloudTrail. Here we are here. Now, I don't have any trails now. I'm going to create a new one now. So you've got to give it a unique name. And what's interesting is that if you do have any duplicates, it won't allow you to proceed. So I'm going to go ArcSight CloudTrail Demo. I'm going to not apply it to all regions. I'm going to apply it to just this region. I'm going to switch off KMS events. I'm not using any key management system, so I won't worry about that. Everything else can sort of be left by default. It's totally up to you what you want to capture. You can capture very granular events, individual API object calls and so forth, but you can imagine that will generate a lot of logs, and the question becomes how security relevant are they? So it might be easier just to leave those switched off. But if we scroll down, we'll create a new S3 bucket, and I'll give it a new a unique name. And I'll take note of that because I need that information later on. And we just open up the advanced piece here, and we can put in a log prefix if we want. Totally up to you. Enable log file validation, and the key piece here is actually this SNS notification. we need to create a new SNS topic if there's one not already available. So I'll click on yes. And what I'll do is I'll give it a SNS topic so it's easy to discern. Everything else is done. So we can create that trail now. The bucket name is invalid. We'll have a look to see what's actually invalid about it. Up to 63 characters. I'll see if that works. That's a little better. And so now this is all ready to go. So if we click on it again, we'll see that we're sending all our events to this ArcSight 123 buckets. We're publishing to SNS topic. Here's our SNS topic ARN. Some of this information is required in the configuration and so forth in SQS and so forth. So it's actually easier just to grab a copy of that stuff as we go along. But you'll notice up here we've got logging is switched on. Come back here. Status is a green light, so we're good to go. So now we can come across to the SNS. If you have a look there, you'll see I've now got a topic, which is nice. Good. And we can then create the SQS queue. Now at the moment I don't have a queue, so I'll create one now, and I will ArcSight queue. Now all this can pretty much be left as default. We've got two types of queues that we can create, standard and FIFO. Standard is all we need. We just want once delivery, best effort ordering. That's just fine for what we need. Now what's interesting about the queue is that by default the basic access policy won't work. It's a bit disconcerting in that regard. We actually have to do a little bit of editing on the actual advanced topic queue policy. And so what I'll do is I'll actually delete this policy and I'll paste in one that's slightly modified. I find that the default policy won't work for what we need. You've actually got to go a little bit deeper. I've actually changed the principal from an AWS account to the actual SNS service. I've also said all I want to be able to do is send a message, publish that message. The resource is of course the ARN of the queue, and as long as the actual source ARN is that of the SNS topic that I just created. So I've created a more granular policy to nail down who has access to send messages to the queue. And as I said, the default policy just does not appear to work. It doesn't appear to be granular enough. It seems to be because it's based upon the actual user, not so much the service. So so that's the new JSON. We can use what's called a dead letter queue as well, and that's basically sending undeliverable messages to a different queue. But that's completely optional. If we've got problems there in terms of delivering messages, we're just not going to get events or new events into our smart connector. So that may be something you might like to consider. But that's all there is to the queue. We save that, assuming there's no JSON validation errors, of course. Now this queue here, I want to take note of this. I want to copy this URL because that's a configuration piece that I'll be giving to the connector as well. So we'll take note of that. I'll just paste it into my notepad. And now last but not least, I actually want this queue to subscribe to the SNS topic. And I can do that here. I can actually do it the other way around here if I want to. Subscribe. And after a few seconds, you'll see the subscription appear. So we're just waiting for SNS and SQS services to talk and to link up, and we're good there. I generally like to open this queue up properly, because what we see here, if we keep refreshing the page, is the number of messages that are available. So as CloudTrail dumps new files into S3, we should be seeing new messages being made available if we've done things correctly. The biggest problem I've seen is not having SNS have sufficient access to publish messages to the queue, and that's typically why my installs have failed in the past, and that's why we update that access policy here on the queue itself to something a little bit more meaningful. And it can take a little while for new messages to start to appear, but what we've got now is we've got the bucket set up, we've got the SNS set up, we've got the SQS set up, and of course the CloudTrail itself is also set up, and we know it's logging, it's all green lights, it's ready to go. So we're in a good position now to actually install the connector. So let's just take one last look at the SQS queue to make sure that we're getting messages, and as I refresh, yes, I've got a message available. So that's a good sign that SNS is pushing messages to the queue, and it's these messages in the queue that our smart connector is looking for. So if that's always 0, then we have a problem. So with that, what we'll do now is go ahead and actually install the connector. Alright, so let's pop over to the actual EC2 console, and what I've got here is a CloudTrail virtual machine. Now this is just a stock standard 7.6 CentOS supported by our connector framework, and it's in a private network. I can't get to it from the outside world. So what I've also got here is a Windows jump host, which actually has an IP address in a public subnet and also an IP address in the private subnet, so I can effectively jump across to it and effectively cheat that way. So now that I go into my Windows RDP session, this is my CloudTrail connector box, and I have a copy of the connector framework here, and I'll just start up the console. And we'll just install the framework. Alright, so that's installed. I'll just zoom in a little bit here so it's a bit easier for us to read. And this is a micro-sized VM, so it's only a single core machine with 1 gig of RAM, so it's the smallest that could run a smart connector. We'll just breeze through all this, we're not too interested in that stuff. And you'll notice in version 8 of the connector framework, CloudTrail is number 1. Then there's an S3 version for Cisco Umbrella as number 2, or second on the list, we're number 1. So we're going to install 0. If you were doing CloudWatch, it's actually about 126 on the list, so it's quite a long way down, but we're interested in CloudTrail here, so we'll install that. We don't have any sort of a proxy. Now it's going to start asking us the specifics around access to AWS. And it's important to keep in mind you're not going to see any feedback on the access and secret key. So keep that in mind. You'll sit there wondering why you're not seeing anything. It's deliberately hidden. Now this is this all-important SQS URL that I mentioned you should keep a note of. And there it is there. So using the access and secret key, I'm going to go to that URL and start pulling messages off the queue. We need to obviously take note of the region, which in my case is AP-Southeast 2. This can be left as defaults. So you've got an SQS region and you've got an S3 region. Most of the time they're going to be in the same region. And what I don't actually have a logger or an ESM installed, so I'm just going to pop it into a Ceph file for now, just to prove that this is actually working. I'll do short rotation just to make sure it's working. It's in AWS in Sydney. And after that, we just go through the normal process of registering the destination and the connector. And if I haven't made any mistakes, if I've set things up correctly, fingers crossed, everything should be fine, and we'll come back with a working connector. So while that's actually installing, I'll just pop back to my SQS queue and just see if there's any more messages. And yeah, after a couple of minutes I've got a few more. Now you are going to see more messages become available more quickly if you've got a large VPC with a lot of events being generated. Now I basically have very little infrastructure installed in my AWS instance, so that's why the messages are coming through pretty slowly, and that's to be expected. But if this was 0 right now, we would be troubleshooting. Alright, so that's good. Install as a service. So that's all done. We now have a working CloudTrail connector. Start it up. And we can now watch those logs flow through, and hopefully we see something interesting. And you'll see here, if I shut that down, new device found, SNS, config, S3, Lambda. So there you go, we're now starting to see our first events already. What's interesting is that I'll show you one other message that you might be interested in, polled. Now you're going to see these polling messages appear on a regular basis. If you're having trouble pulling events, you'll see this being 0 all the time. But as you can see, I can see a couple of events coming through quite nicely now. So I'm quite confident that's working very, very well. And the other one I wanted to show you was just quickly to make sure that you're actually connecting successfully to the queue, is just cat your agent.log file and grep on SQS, and you should get a message like this: successfully found the SQS URL for the region. So that's a good start as well. So there's just a couple of tips on troubleshooting and making sure everything's working correctly. So if I've done everything correctly, I should start to see actual Ceph messages here. And suffice to say that we do. So here we have Ceph, Amazon, SNS, list topics, assume role. So we're definitely getting relevant events now. So I can actually go ahead and set a new destination as my logger or ESM. It might be Kafka bus, transformation hub, and so forth. But that is now complete. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it informative. If you have any questions or queries, please don't hesitate to contact me at shane.lilly@microfocus.com. Thank you for watching.